The world grows quieter when winter takes hold. Sound softens, distance blurs, and people disappear more easily than anyone wants to admit. In places like this, survival isn't about strength. It's about choices made when no one is watching. Tonight's story begins in that silence, where an old cabin stands against the snow. A loyal dog listens to what humans can't hear, and a man who once walked away from responsibility is about to face it again. This isn't a story told with noise or spectacle. It's told with breath, cold, and the moment everything changes. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please make sure to subscribe for more. Your support truly means the world. Now, let's begin. Winter pressed down on the Wyoming high country like a held breath, snow drifting sideways under a colorless sky, the forest silent except for wind worrying the pines and the slow, patient creak of ice. Robert Hale had chosen this place because nothing came looking for you here. At 64, he moved through the world with the economy of a man who had learned which motions mattered and which ones only wasted strength. He stood just over 6 feet, though time and old injuries had stolen a fraction of that height, leaving his posture slightly compressed, shoulders still broad but sloped forward as if bracing against something no one else could see. His hair, once a deep brown, had faded into iron gray, kept short out of habit rather than vanity, and his beard grew in unevenly, thick along the jaw and chin, thinner at the cheeks, the kind of beard a man wears when mirrors no longer hold authority. His face was angular, cut with lines that did not soften when he smiled, because smiling had become a rare and carefully rationed act. The most revealing feature was his eyes, light, almost washed-out blue, steady and watchful, carrying the distant focus of someone who had spent too many years scanning rooms for exits. The cabin sat low among the trees, built of darkened logs stacked with functional precision rather than craftsmanship. Robert had reinforced it himself over the years, adding storm shutters, thick door braces, and a narrow porch that caught drifting snow like a net. It was not a home designed for comfort. It was a structure meant to endure. Inside, the air smelled of pine resin, old iron, and wood smoke that never fully left the walls. Every object had a reason for being where it was. Tools hung at reachable height. Supplies were counted and rotated. Nothing decorative remained because decoration invited attachment, and attachment led to hesitation. That had been the lesson that ended his career. Robert had not left the SWAT unit because he had grown weak or slow. He had left because he had refused to look away. Years earlier, during a joint operation that went wrong in a way reports never quite captured, he had questioned an order that treated collateral damage as an acceptable margin. The decision to speak had been quiet, procedural, and deeply inconvenient. There had been no dramatic fallout, no public reckoning, just a gradual closing of doors, a reassignment that felt less like a transition and more like erasure. By the time he officially retired, his name carried weight only as something better not mentioned. He accepted it without protest, not because he agreed, but because he understood how systems protected themselves. Isolation, he learned, was often easier than resistance. The only being who had followed him without hesitation was Bruno. The German shepherd lay near the hearth, massive even by the standards of his breed, his body thick through the chest and shoulders, muscles still defined beneath a coat that had begun to silver along the muzzle and eyebrows. At 9 years old, Bruno moved more carefully now, favoring his left hind leg on cold mornings, but there was nothing tentative about his presence. His ears, large and scarred at the edges from years of service, rested half back even in sleep, attuned to changes in sound most humans would never register. His eyes were amber, darker than they once had been, holding an intelligence sharpened by training and tempered by experience. A faint scar ran along his flank where shrapnel had once kissed too close, the fur there growing back slightly darker, coarser, as if remembering the impact. Bruno had been a working dog before retirement, trained for detection, pursuit, and protection. Unlike Robert, he had not struggled with the transition. Purpose for Bruno had never been tied to uniforms or commands. It lived in proximity. Guarding the cabin, shadowing Robert's movements, watching the tree line, these were assignments he accepted without question. Loyalty in Bruno's world did not require justification. That night, the wind sharpened as dusk collapsed into full darkness, the kind of fast-moving storm that erased tracks within minutes. Robert finished securing the shutters and checked the generator by headlamp, his fingers stiff but precise as he tested connections. He did not fear storms. He respected them. They followed rules, even brutal ones. When he stepped back inside, shaking snow from his coat, he noticed the shift immediately. Bruno had risen to his feet. The dog's posture had changed in a way Robert recognized instinctively. The casual sprawl near the hearth was gone, replaced by a squared stance, head lifted, ears forward, body angled toward the north-facing wall. Bruno did not bark. He rarely did unless there was no alternative. Instead, his breathing slowed, deepened, each inhale measured, as if conserving energy for something that had not yet arrived. His gaze fixed on a point beyond the cabin, beyond the trees, into the storm itself. Robert felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the quiet recalibration that came when long-dormant instincts stirred. He did not move immediately. He watched Bruno, noting the tension along the dog's spine, the slight flare of nostrils catching scent, carried erratically by the wind. This was not wildlife. Bruno had a different response to elk, to wolves, to the occasional mountain lion that passed through the valley. This was sharper, more deliberate. "You hear something I don't," Robert murmured, his voice low, more observation than question. Bruno's ears twitched and his tail went rigid. Robert reached for his coat without conscious thought, layering it over stiff shoulders, then grabbed the flashlight and rope he kept coiled by the door. His movements were slower than they once had been, joints protesting in the cold, but they were efficient. Outside, the wind struck like a physical force, snow slicing sideways, visibility collapsing into a narrow cone of white illuminated by the beam. Bruno moved ahead immediately, nose low, paws cutting through drifts with the practiced economy of a dog who knew how to work without wasting motion. They did not go far at first. Robert stopped at the tree line, scanning, listening, letting the storm speak. The forest felt altered, not louder, not quieter, but charged as if something had disturbed a balance he could not see. Bruno paused, then veered east, tugging the rope just enough to make his intention clear. Robert hesitated. This was the moment he had structured his life to avoid, the point where silence could still be chosen. Turning back would be easy, sensible even. He could tell himself the storm played tricks, that Bruno had misread a scent twisted by wind and cold. No one would know, no one would ask. But he knew what that choice would cost. He followed. Each step away from the cabin felt like crossing a line he had drawn years ago, one that marked the boundary between observation and involvement. Snow filled his boots, cold biting through layers, breath burning his lungs. Bruno slowed near a stand of spruce, stopping short, body angling protectively, a low, restrained sound vibrating in his chest. Robert's light swept the ground, then lifted, and something in him went still. There were shapes ahead, indistinct at first, half swallowed by snow and shadow, wrong in a way his mind resisted naming. The storm continued its indifferent assault, branches creaking overhead, flakes settling without concern for what lay beneath them. Robert felt the weight of recognition settle deep, not as fear, but as certainty. Whatever waited in that darkness was not an accident. And standing there, the wind tearing at him, a dog steady at his side, Robert understood that the quiet he had built his life around was about to fracture. Winter, relentless and patient, had found him anyway, not to punish, but to ask a question he could no longer ignore. The forest did not announce them all at once. Robert saw fragments first, boots half buried in drifted snow, a sleeve stiff with ice, the unnatural stillness of bodies that had stopped fighting the cold, not because they had surrendered, but because their strength had been measured and found insufficient. Bruno slowed instinctively, placing himself slightly ahead and to the side, his broad frame angled between Robert and the shapes beneath the trees. The dog's hackles lifted just enough to signal threat without panic, his breath steady, controlled, the way it had been in darker places long ago. They were women, grown, not young, not old, suspended between exhaustion and unconsciousness. One lay slumped against the trunk of a spruce, taller and broader through the shoulders, her winter jacket torn at the sleeve, insulation spilling like pale feathers frozen in place. Her hair was blonde, once braided tightly for practicality, now undone by wind and ice, strands plastered against a face gone waxy with cold. Her skin was fair beneath the frostbite bloom creeping along her cheeks, her jaw set even in semi-unconsciousness, as if defiance had outlasted sensation. She stood close to 6 feet, built for endurance rather than speed, the kind of body shaped by physical labor rather than gym discipline. The second woman was smaller, leaner, folded inward as if conserving heat had become instinctive. She had dark brown hair cut just past her shoulders, tangled now and rimmed with frost, framing a narrower face with sharp cheekbones and lips gone blue. Her skin held a warmer olive tone beneath the cold damage, suggesting heritage from somewhere far from this latitude. She wore a ranger-style outer layer, functional but worn thin at the elbows, the fabric stiff with ice. Her breaths were shallow but rapid, a sign her body was still fighting, still calculating survival. Robert did not need a forensic report to understand what he was seeing. There were no defensive wounds from animals, no signs of a fall, no scattered belongings. Their packs lay several yards away, placed rather than dropped, straps cut cleanly. This was not misadventure. This was design. Someone had brought them here, restrained them just enough, and then walked away, trusting the storm to erase the rest. "Easy," Robert murmured, though he did not know which of them he was addressing. He dropped to one knee despite the protest in his joints, checking pulses with fingers already numbing, reading the small signs his training had taught him to prioritize. The taller woman's pulse was slow, irregular, dangerously faint. The smaller woman's heart raced, frantic but present, her body burning through reserves faster than it could replace them. Bruno moved in close, pressing his side against the taller woman's legs, his body heat radiating through dense fur, offering warmth without instruction. Robert noted it with a quiet acknowledgement. The dog had made the same assessment he had. Names came later. For now, there was only order. Robert worked quickly but not recklessly. He wrapped both women in emergency insulation from his pack, sealing edges against the wind, then rigged a makeshift harness using rope and strap salvaged from the abandoned packs. Lifting the taller woman was like hauling dead weight, her muscles unresponsive, her head lolling dangerously as he settled her against his shoulder. Pain flared through his lower back, sharp and immediate, a reminder of limits he no longer ignored. He adjusted, breathed through it, and continued. The smaller woman stirred as he secured her, eyes fluttering open just enough to register presence. Her gaze flicked to his face, then to Bruno, confusion giving way to a flicker of guarded awareness. She tried to speak, failed, swallowed hard instead. "You're safe for now," Robert said, voice low, even. "Don't waste air." She nodded once, a minimal movement that told him more about her discipline than any words could have. The return to the cabin was slow, punishing. Snow thickened with each step, wind clawing at exposed skin. Robert dragged the taller woman on an improvised sled, fashioned from a broken branch and rope, muscles burning, breath scraping raw through his lungs. Bruno ranged ahead and back, choosing paths where drifts were thinner, circling whenever Robert stopped, pressing close when the wind surged. The smaller woman followed behind, supported by a line looped around Robert's shoulder, her steps uneven but determined, eyes fixed on the ground ahead with fierce concentration. By the time the cabin emerged from the storm, Robert's hands shook with exhaustion. Inside, warmth returned grudgingly as he stoked the fire, stripped away frozen layers, replaced them with dry wool and blankets. The taller woman was laid near the hearth, elevated slightly, her jacket cut away to assess injuries. Bruising bloomed dark along her ribs and upper arm, marks of restraint rather than impact. The smaller woman was positioned farther back, circulation still fragile, her shivering violent but promising. As heat worked its way back into their bodies, fragments surfaced. The smaller woman spoke first, her voice hoarse but controlled. Her name was Sarah Collins. She was in her early 40s, about 5'7", built lean with wiry strength, posture economical even while seated. Years of field work had taught her efficiency, not bravado. She explained in broken sentences that they had been surveying irregular activity along protected land boundaries. Equipment tracks where none should exist, timber cut clean and removed under cover of storms. When reports went unanswered, they had come out themselves, trusting experience over protocol. The taller woman, Megan Rowe, regained consciousness later. She was mid-40s, broad-shouldered, solid, her movements deliberate even through pain. Her voice was lower, steadier, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to responsibility. She confirmed Sarah's account with fewer words, adding one detail Robert found particularly troubling. The men who intercepted them had not worn insignia. They had not threatened. They had simply acted, methodical, efficient, confident that Winter would finish what they started. Robert listened without interrupting, cataloging information the way he always had. Illegal extraction, remote terrain, seasonal storms used as cover. Silence enforced not with bullets, but with cold. He had seen versions of this before, overseas and closer to home, patterns repeating because they worked. Bruno lay between the women and the door, head resting on his paws, eyes never fully closing. When Megan reached out, fingers brushing his fur in a gesture more reflex than intention, he did not move away. Outside, the storm pressed on, relentless. Inside, something had shifted. Robert stood by the window, watching snow erase the last of their tracks, understanding with quiet clarity that the choice he had made beyond the tree line had consequences that would not end at his doorstep. Winter had not brought them here by chance, and it was not finished yet. The storm did not weaken after nightfall. It thickened, pressing snow against the cabin walls until the windows became pale, lightless mirrors. Inside, heat pooled unevenly, rising from the hearth in slow waves that fought the cold inch by inch. Robert sat on a low stool near the fire, his back straight despite the ache crawling along his spine, eyes moving constantly, not toward the women, who slept now under layered blankets, but toward the spaces between things, corners, shadows, the silence between gusts. Bruno sensed it first. The German shepherd rose without sound, his large frame unfolding with deliberate restraint, his ears angled toward the north-facing wall, not fully erect but tuned, triangulating. The fur along his shoulders lifted slightly, a reaction so subtle most people would miss it. But Robert did not. He had seen that posture before, on rooftops, in alleys, in rooms where danger waited rather than announced itself. Bruno's breathing slowed, nostrils flaring as if tasting the air through wood and ice. "What is it, boy?" Robert murmured, more for grounding than inquiry. Bruno did not look back. His attention remained fixed outward. Robert stood, joints protesting, and moved toward the window without turning on additional light. He slid a narrow slat in the shutter aside, just enough to look through, careful not to break the silhouette of the cabin. Outside, the storm reduced depth to illusion. Snow erased distance, softened shapes, swallowed sound. At first, there was nothing. Then he saw it. Not movement, but absence. A stretch of snow near the tree line where accumulation looked thinner, disturbed not by wind but by weight. It was subtle, deliberate. Someone had been there. He closed the shutter quietly and moved back toward the center of the cabin, mind narrowing into the familiar geometry of assessment. He did not reach for a weapon. He reached for structure. He checked the door braces, the window latches, the reinforced beam he had installed years earlier when he still trusted his instincts enough to listen to them. This was not a place to confront. This was a place to endure. Sarah stirred near the hearth, her body reacting to the shift in temperature and tension before her mind fully followed. Even half asleep, her posture remained compact, arms drawn inward, conserving warmth. When she opened her eyes, they were sharp despite fatigue, scanning the room before settling on Robert. She did not ask what was wrong. She did not need to. "There's someone out there," she said quietly, voice hoarse but steady. "Possibly," Robert replied, "or someone who was." Megan remained asleep, her breathing deeper, more even. She had taken longer to stabilize, her body larger, the cold having had more surface to claim. Robert let her rest. Sarah shifted carefully, pulling her blanket tighter, dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. In the firelight, the lines of exhaustion on her face were more apparent. Now, creases at the corners of her eyes, tension held too long in the jaw. She was a woman used to carrying information rather than sharing it, and the weight showed. "They didn't expect you," she said after a moment. Whoever left us out there?" Robert nodded. They expected winter. Sarah watched Bruno, who now stood between them and the door, his body angled outward, a living barrier. "You trained him," she said. "Yes." "Law enforcement?" "Before," Robert answered. He did not elaborate. The cabin creaked as a gust slammed into the far wall, snow hissing across the roof like thrown sand. In the brief lull that followed, Robert's thoughts drifted backward, uninvited. Not to the rescue he had just made, but to another room, another night, years ago. A briefing space lit by fluorescence, faces drawn tight with fatigue and pressure. An order delivered in clipped language that disguised its consequences. He remembered the silence that followed when he asked a single question no one wanted answered. What happens to the people in the wrong place when this goes sideways? The answer had been administrative, procedural, final. That was the moment the unit had turned inward, not against him openly, but enough to mark him as inconvenient. He had not been forced out. He had been made irrelevant. Retirement came later, dressed up as choice. He accepted it because the alternative was to keep standing in rooms where silence was rewarded and doubt was punished. Outside, a branch cracked under weight, sharp enough to cut through the storm's white noise. Bruno shifted, muscles coiling without sound. Robert raised a hand, not to command, but to steady. This was not a dog ready to charge. This was a partner waiting for instruction. "We hold," Robert said quietly. "Nothing moves unless it has to." Sarah nodded. She did not argue. She had seen the cost of impulsive courage in the field, had learned that survival often favored patience over force. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, weathered notebook, its cover bent, pages wrinkled from moisture. She did not open it yet, just held it, as if grounding herself through familiar texture. "They've been cutting timber at night," she said softly. "Old growth, selective, clean work, machinery that doesn't leave tracks long enough to follow unless you know when to look." Robert absorbed the information without reaction. "And no one responds to reports." "They do," she said. "Just not the way they should." That was enough. Another absence caught Robert's attention, a gap in the storm's rhythm, too regular to be natural. He eased closer to the back wall, listening through timber and insulation. There it was again. A pause, then the faintest crunch, controlled, careful. Someone testing proximity without committing. Robert adjusted the cabin's interior light, lowering it further, letting shadows deepen. He moved objects quietly. Clearing. Paths, removing anything that might scrape or betray movement. He did not think of this as preparation for violence. He thought of it as buying time. Bruno mirrored him, repositioning with intelligence born of repetition. The dog's age showed now in the careful way he chose each step, conserving strength rather than spending it. At 9 years old, he could no longer sprint endlessly, but his judgment had sharpened. He did not waste effort. Minutes stretched, then longer. The presence outside never crossed the threshold. It circled, tested, withdrew. Whoever it was knew better than to force an entry in a storm like this. Cold punished mistakes. Visibility betrayed haste. The cabin remained sealed, silent, stubborn. Eventually, the pressure eased, not gone, just postponed. Robert exhaled slowly, tension bleeding from his shoulders in increments rather than all at once. He did not sit. He remained standing, watchful, understanding the pattern now. This was not a search. This was confirmation. Someone needed to know whether the problem they had left for winter had resolved itself. It hadn't. He looked at Sarah, then at Megan, still asleep, still alive. He looked at Bruno, whose ears remained half-cocked, listening beyond the walls. The old question rose again, unchanged by time. Stay quiet and stay safe. Or speak and accept what follows. Robert did not answer it yet, but for the first time in years he did not push it away either. Dawn did not arrive with light so much as permission. The storm loosened its grip by degrees, wind dropping from a howl to a rasp, snow settling into a steady fall that revealed edges again, tree lines, drifts, distance. Robert took advantage of the shift without ceremony. He moved while the world was still uncertain, when footsteps could be explained away by weather, and the forest had not yet decided who belonged in it. He layered up quietly, checked the fire, and left Sarah and Megan resting near the hearth. Sarah watched him from beneath her blanket, eyes alert despite exhaustion. She understood the calculus of timing. Megan slept on, her larger frame still reclaiming heat, breath deep and regular. Bruno waited by the door, tail low, ears angled forward, the old readiness coiled beneath patience. Outside, Robert followed the perimeter he had memorized years ago, not searching for confrontation, but for story. He read snow the way some men read faces, where weight lingered, where steps corrected themselves, where purpose overrode panic. He photographed boot impressions with a compact camera he kept for wildlife surveys, careful to include scale and angle. The tread was utilitarian, cold-rated, spaced for stability rather than speed. Not locals, not hunters. He marked coordinates with a handheld GPS, logging timestamps that matched the storm's earlier intensification. Whoever moved out here knew when weather would hide them. Near the north slope, he found the telltale signs Sarah had described. Timber, cut cleanly at knee height, not felled to crash but removed in sections, dragged downslope where snow would mask gouges. Sap bled amber against white, frozen mid-drip. He documented it all, stumps, drag marks, a discarded length of cable stiff with ice, evidence that did not rely on testimony, only on physics. Bruno stiffened suddenly, a low vibration in his chest. Robert froze. A faint metallic clink came from the tree line, careless, brief. Robert raised his camera and waited. Nothing followed. When he moved again, Bruno shadowed him closely, body angled outward. A sharp snap cracked beneath the dog's paw, wire, half buried. Bruno recoiled, a thin line opening along his foreleg where the wire had kissed skin. It was shallow, a warning more than a wound. Robert knelt immediately, gloved hands steady, pressing snow to slow the bleed. Bruno accepted the care without sound, amber eyes fixed beyond Robert's shoulder. "Easy," Robert murmured. "You did right." He cut the wire free and photographed the placement. Not a trap meant to kill, meant to signal. Someone had wanted to know if the perimeter was breached. Robert logged the location, then withdrew along a route that overlapped his own tracks to confuse sequence. Time was on his side if he let it be. Back at the cabin, Sarah helped clean Bruno's leg, her movements efficient despite fatigue. She was a woman who wasted nothing. Motion, words, emotion. Her dark hair was pulled. Back now, exposing a face marked by sun and wind, skin olive-toned and weathered, eyes sharp with the habit of noticing what others dismissed. Megan sat upright nearby, broad shoulders hunched forward as heat reclaimed her muscles. Her blonde hair had been rebraided with practiced hands. She looked like someone who trusted preparation over optimism. "That wire wasn't for us," Megan said quietly after Robert explained. "It's for them. Confirmation." Robert nodded. "They don't need us gone. They need us quiet." Sarah opened her notebook and finally spoke at length, voice steady. She described night movements timed to storms, trucks modified for cold, routes that skirted ranger patrols by minutes. She had logged it all, dates, bearings, anomalies. When she finished, Robert weighed the stack of facts against the reality of distance and weather. "There's a relay up the ridge," he said. "Old federal repeater. Decommissioned, but the mast's still there. If the storm breaks enough, I can reach a ranger station without lighting up the valley." Megan met his eyes. "And if they're listening?" "I won't say names," Robert replied. "Only coordinates and photographs. Let the land speak." He waited for the lull he knew would come, a thinning of snow, a quiet between gusts, and then he went. The climb was slow, deliberate. Bruno insisted on coming, despite the bandage, moving with careful economy, choosing steps that spared the injured leg. The repeater stood skeletal against the sky, ice-laced and stubborn. Robert powered the handset, shielded the antenna with his body, and transmitted in bursts, short, factual, unadorned. Coordinates, evidence, a request routed through federal forestry channels that still remembered how to listen. On the descent, he felt the shift before he saw it. Not pursuit, presence, someone testing range again. He did not hurry. He let the forest do its work. By the time he reached the cabin, the sense eased, unresolved. Inside, warmth and quiet returned. Bruno lay down at last, head on paws, injury already clotting. Robert sat between the women, watchful, the old weight settling into place. not dread but responsibility. Outside, snow continued to fall, indifferent to secrets. The truth, he knew, did not freeze. It waited. Morning arrived quietly, without spectacle. The storm did not end so much as step back, leaving behind a pale sky stretched thin over the valley and a silence that felt earned rather than empty. Snow still covered everything, but it no longer pressed down with hostility. It rested. Robert noticed the difference immediately, the way a man notices when pain shifts from sharp to dull, still present but no longer in control. The approach of the authorities came the same way. No sirens, no helicopters cutting the sky. Just vehicles moving slowly along Forest Service roads that had not seen regular traffic in years. Robert watched from the porch as the first truck emerged from the trees, white paint dulled by weather, insignia understated. He had positioned himself where he could see them without being seen, habit rather than fear guiding the choice. The lead ranger stepped out first, a man in his late 40s with a square, weather-beaten face and a short, practical beard gone gray at the edges. His build was solid, functional, the body of someone who spent more time outdoors than behind a desk. His eyes moved constantly, not nervously, but with trained curiosity, cataloging terrain before people. His name was Mark Ellison, though Robert felt no need to ask. Men like that carried their names lightly. Behind him came two federal officers, quieter, sharper around the edges. One was a woman in her early 40s, tall and lean, dark hair pulled into a tight knot beneath her cap, skin pale against the cold, eyes alert but patient. The other was older, mid-50s perhaps, heavier through the shoulders, his movements careful in the snow, breath fogging beneath a trimmed mustache. Neither looked surprised by what they found. That told Robert everything he needed to know about the strength of the evidence he had sent. Sarah and Megan remained inside, watching through the window. Sarah stood wrapped in a thick coat Robert had loaned her, the sleeves slightly long for her lean frame. In daylight, her build looked even more economical. No excess, no wasted motion. Her hair, dark brown with faint strands of gray near the temples, framed a face that had learned to stay neutral under pressure. Megan sat nearby, taller even seated, broad shoulders filling the chair, her posture straighter now despite lingering bruises. Her blonde hair caught the morning light, making her look stronger than she felt, which suited her just fine. Bruno lay on the porch near Robert's feet, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. The bandage on his leg was clean and dry. At 9 years old, his muzzle had gone fully silver, giving him a dignified, almost ancient look, but his ears still tracked every sound. When the officers approached the cabin, he did not rise. He assessed. Then, satisfied, he settled again. Approval given. The process unfolded without drama. Coordinates were confirmed, photographs were reviewed, timber sites were flagged. The wire markers Robert had documented were cataloged and traced. Mark Ellison listened more than he spoke, nodding once or twice as the picture came together. There was no praise offered, no questions about why Robert lived out here alone. Professional respect did not require conversation. When it was time to escort Sarah and Megan out, there was no rush. Sarah packed her notebook carefully, sliding it into her coat as if placing a weight back where it belonged. Megan tested her shoulder, grimaced, then ignored it. She stood in front of Robert, tall enough that they met eye to eye without either needing to adjust. "You did the right thing," she said, voice low and steady. Robert nodded once. "So did you." Sarah lingered a moment longer. She looked around the cabin, at the reinforced beams, the worn floor, the absence of anything unnecessary. She understood places like this. She understood people who built them. "They'll ask questions," she said, "about you." "They always do," Robert replied. "Answers are optional." She smiled faintly at that, the expression brief but sincere. Then they were gone, their footprints already softening as snow began its quiet work again. By afternoon, the valley returned to itself. Vehicles disappeared, radios went silent. The cabin stood unchanged, except for the knowledge it now held. Robert walked the perimeter one last time, checking where snow had been disturbed, where evidence had been lifted, where winter would soon smooth everything over. He did not feel erased by it this time. Inside, he set about repairs. Not the urgent kind, No barricades, no reinforcements, but small acts of restoration. He replaced a cracked shutter hinge, tightened a loose stairboard, resealed a gap where wind liked to find its way in. Each task took time. Each task grounded him. This was work that asked for presence, not vigilance. Bruno followed him from room to room, slower than he once had been, but content. When Robert stopped, the dog stopped. When Robert sat, Bruno lay nearby, the rhythm of companionship restored to something simple and honest. In the late afternoon, Robert opened the door and let sunlight spill across the porch. Bruno moved forward and lay down where the warmth reached him, eyes closing fully now, tail giving a slow, satisfied sweep against the wood. Robert watched him for a long moment. He thought of all the places Bruno had guarded him, in cities whose names he no longer spoke, in rooms filled with fear and bad decisions, in forests like this one, where silence could mean safety or death depending on who controlled it. The dog had never questioned direction. He had trusted the man beside him to choose wisely. That trust had never really gone away. Robert had simply stopped believing he deserved it. As evening approached, the cold returned, but without threat. Robert lit the fire, brewed coffee strong enough to bite, and sat by the window as the first stars appeared. He did not feel the pull to leave. He did not feel the urge to disappear further into the wilderness. The cabin no longer felt like a place of retreat. It felt like a responsibility, light, manageable, honest. The world beyond would continue with or without him. That was no longer an insult. It was a relief. Winter remained, stretched across the valley in white and blue, vast and indifferent. But it was no longer an enemy. It was a season. And seasons, Robert knew now, did not exist to be fought. They existed to be endured, learned from, and when the time came, left behind without regret. He rested his hand briefly on Bruno's broad back, feeling warmth and steady breath beneath his palm. For the first time in years, the quiet did not feel like avoidance. It felt like peace earned honestly by a man who had chosen, at the last moment that mattered, not to turn away. At the end of this story, one truth stands quietly but unshaken. Miracles rarely arrive as thunder or light from the sky. More often, they come as a steady presence in the cold, through a man who refuses to look away, a loyal companion who senses danger before it speaks, or a choice made when silence would have been easier. God's work does not always announce itself. It moves through ordinary people who decide to act when fear offers them an excuse to turn back. In our daily lives, we may never face a blizzard in the wilderness, but we all face moments where someone nearby needs help, courage, or compassion. When you choose to step forward instead of retreating, you become part of that quiet miracle. If this story spoke to your heart, carry it with you into the way you treat others today. Share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts or prayers, and subscribe to this channel so these stories of faith, resilience, and grace can continue to reach more lives.